Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joined today by Louis Vachon, the Chief Executive Officer of National Bank of Canada. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
I'll jump right into it. You know, National Bank's biggest business is personal and commercial banking. It's something that you share with all the other Canadian lenders. However, you do have a strong focus in Quebec. I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of consumer credit conditions, debt levels, and mortgages at your bank in Quebec.
Conditions remain very, very good. First of all, the employment, we're, for the first time in documented history, Quebec has the lowest unemployment rate of any provinces in Canada. In terms of labor participation rate, we're sitting, also very high percentages. We have the second highest employment level by women in the workforce after Sweden. So people are working. And when people are working, they're spending and they're also saving quite a bit. The saving rate is quite high. The other thing so people are working and housing affordability is still remains very good in Quebec. So people have access to property and they don't have to borrow a huge amount of money to get access to property. So you end up with basically high savings rate and lower debt to income ratios in terms of debt for consumers.
But are you seeing any danger signs looming? And is Quebec, do you see it as a bit different than the rest of Canada?
No, danger signs, no. Not in the real estate. It's still, it's mid to high single digit increases in valuations. In some markets in Montreal, it's not the whole thing. And it's very concentrated in 5 or 6 neighborhoods where you see more international investors in. For the rest of the market, it's still, I think it's still very much under control.
And throughout the day, we've been asking our panelists and guests about their expectations of a Canadian recession in the next 12 months. What are your thoughts?
Well, my very good chief economist was here and gave a number at 30%. So who am I to argue with that number? The question, I think the issue is, I think the 30%, whatever the probability is, I don't think if there is a recession in Canada in 2020, it's not going to be made in Canada. It's clearly going to be caused by geoeconomic factors coming from outside of Canada. I think that's the key thing.
Right. Well, let's drill one of your biggest areas of the business is mortgages. Let's take a little bit of a closer look on that. We've seen growth in uninsured mortgages rise while insured mortgages have declined in the past couple of years. It's a trend that we've seen actually with all the Canadian banks. I'm wondering, how is that affecting your credit profile at the bank?
We're not concerned about that right now. I think we're quite comfortable. I think in terms of credit, consumer credit, we've been clear on 2 points. One, we're overweight Quebec, and we want to remain overweight Quebec. Doesn't mean we're not growing outside of Quebec. We just want to make sure that our growth outside of Quebec is at the same speed as what we're generating in Quebec, which is pretty easy to do right now. The second one, we have a strong preference, and we've said that for many years, for secured receivables versus unsecured ones. What it means is, we like HELOCs, we like mortgages, and we're much less aggressive in terms of credit card receivables. So that's how we're positioned, and we feel that that's the right positioning for the few years to come.
Okay, and business loan growth has also been outpacing retail lending among, again, all the Canadian banks and yourselves. Yet we're facing all these geopolitical concerns, whether we're talking about uncertainties on Brexit or trade wars, and that potentially could threaten companies in the economy. Is the accelerating pace of commercial loan growth a cause for concern for you?
No. And I'll tell you why. I think there's a couple phenomena that explains why we're having commercial loan growth ahead of nominal GDP growth. One of them is the fact that we've had now through both at the provincial level in Quebec and at the federal level, we've seen accelerated depreciation mechanisms. So we see finally, greater numbers in terms of business investments and equipment than we've had, and that helped a little bit loan growth. The second thing, which is a secular trend, which is true in Canada, and I suspect it's true also in the US, most businesses in Canada are owned by baby boomers. And they're getting to their peak years. And they're now in a situation where they have to pass the baton to the next generation. So this business ownership transfer is fueling a lot of financial transactions. Most balance sheets of commercial businesses in Canada, small, medium-sized businesses, are very healthy. So that means that usually the new buyer, the new acquirer, will leverage up the balance sheet a little bit to acquire the company. And that phenomenon, which we've seen, that's fueled M&A activities in investment banking, and I'll say all of you are familiar with this, it's also fueling increased activity in commercial banking. So that's number two. Number three is a healthy level of development in commercial real estate. And when you're looking at demographic growth in Canada, which is quite high, particularly in the three cities of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, there's a lot of activity in commercial real estate. And that's the third element that's fueling commercial loan growth.
Okay. You have one very interesting business within your bank. I mean, you have several, but the one I want to flag is your debt buying business, Credigy. You've had that for a number of years now. It's one of your fastest growing businesses. But however, you said back in August that you guys are now going to be focusing on disciplined growth as you replace assets coming to maturity. I'm wondering, are you still buying debt with that business? And what are you looking at for trying to achieve I think you said your expectations were double-digit growth in 2020.
Yes, we still are. In fact, the reason we're confident about giving guidance to that business for 2020 in terms of double-digit growth in earnings is the fact that we've acquired the portfolios already. So if we just look at the impact of the portfolios we've purchased over the last few quarters, we more than replaced the assets that were maturing in 2019. So that's why we have good visibility. It is Credigy has been part of the National Bank family now for 13 years. They're now full-fledged partners of the bank. And it's a great team, very strong at managing data, at structuring deals. And the flexibility we have in terms of asset class, the type of deals make us quite confident that we can continue to grow earnings on that business, at a steady pace for many years to come.
And as a reminder for people that may not be familiar with Credigy, what kind of debt?
They purchase only consumer debt, so they do not buy commercial debt. So it's the laws of big numbers. They want to buy credit card receivables, auto loans, mortgages, and they purchase both performing loans and non-performing loans. And so that capacity to go to different asset classes, also different geographies. They've made purchases in the past in South America, in the Caribbean, in the US, and Europe. So they have diversification in terms of asset classes, performing, non-performing, and geography. And on that basis, that's why they've been able to be very good allocators of capital.
Now that business shares the same division as some of your international forays, your foreign forays. Some may argue that are potentially in risky areas, geography, and it's far from your Montreal headquarters. We're talking about your investments in Africa, your investments in Asia, in Cambodia specifically. You've been going. You've started investing about 5 years ago. I think it was initially 200 million. It's now I think 625 was about the total.
Yeah.
What have you learned from investing in these far-flung destinations?
That it can be very profitable. That's the first one. Now, I think looking back, what we did right, I think the diversified approach of investing in 3 different locations, in 3 different franchises, I think was the right one. I think we got to know different regions, different markets, and more importantly, different management teams. We saw quite early that we had a big winner with ABA Bank in Cambodia. That's why we moved very quickly to a 40% stake and then a 90%. And now we own 100%. So that's why I think in terms of our international division, the 2 key strategic assets are Credigy and ABA going forward.
But less so Africa, correct?
Africa, yes. I think Africa, we've decided that we will, over time, dispose of those assets and really focus on this. I mean, we're achieving very high level of growth with both Credigy and ABA, and we want to focus on good execution on those assets. And that's the main focus.
We've had changes in Canada affecting the type of senior bonds that banks can issue, a shift to bail-in notes from deposit notes. When it comes to the long-term market funding, should Canada's regulator allow systemic banks to keep selling deposit notes in addition to new senior bail-in?
Great question. I think if this question is raised again, I think we should probably, as an industry, and more specifically a national bank, reach our TLAC level. And once that's reached, and we see how easily that was done and so forth, and what the impact is on our funding, maybe discuss with our regulator if there are any updates or changes or things that should be made to the law, to the current requirements. And but until we get to TLAC, I think that's just focused on what we need to do, and that's what we're doing.
Very good. You were in New York last month, actually, to sign a Principles for Responsible Banking. So you're one of only 3 banks in North America to have done so, and since then you've issued a 3-year, $750 million sustainable bond, and that's obviously targeting ESG investors.
Yes.
What's your appetite for doing more of these? And is there any advantage to doing this type of offering other than sort of subscribing to the values of the bank?
I think the ESG sector is a growing trend within financial markets. It will continue to be. I think that we see that trend, if anything, accelerating. So yes, I think we'll continue to address that. I think, as you know, we need to have the assets on, raising fund is one thing, and deposits and bonds, but we have to have the assets on the other side that match that definition of sustainable, and that's what we're working on. So there's still room to grow, and I think that's a market we're going to continue to access over the next few years, certainly.
Excellent. Canadian corporate bond issuance is trailing last year, about 5% when I looked at it this morning. It's mainly due to lower issuance from the Canadian banks. Why is that? And do you see the trend continuing, or will the banks start to step it up in terms of issuance?
I don't think there's any grand strategy there. I think we all have to meet our TLAC levels, and I think our treasury teams, like the ones of other banks, are being opportunistic and looked around where they can raise the funds and do different deals. So I don't think there's you can read anything in terms of long-term trends in there that's negative on Canada. I think we're just being opportunistic, and as you know, 1 or 2 months can change that trend very, very quickly. Yes. If anything, we've seen is the level of issuance have been very concentrated in terms of calendar, and getting so more and more. So no, there's no long-term trend that I see there that's negative for the Canadian financial markets.
Corporate borrowers will usually cite the deepness of the U.S. Dollar and the euro for issuing in international debt markets. Yeah. Is that an issue that weighs on debt sales in the Canadian bond market?
Well, we're comparing ourselves to the most efficient capital markets in the world. So yeah, okay, Canada is not quite the same level as the U.S. That being said, if I look and I have a few years of experience now, how the Canadian financial market has evolved, particularly on the fixed income side, in terms of being able to absorb and trade and sell different types of securities. And I will point, for instance, to lower grade corporate bonds, even high yield bonds, which 10 or 20 years ago would have been very difficult to issue in Canada. And now we can do much larger issues. So yes, we're comparing ourselves to the deepest capital pool in the world. But that in and of itself, I think the Canadian financial markets are getting able to absorb more and more different deals and more corporate debt.
So, Louis, you're the longest serving among the current crop of Canadian bank CEOs.
But not the oldest.
No, you're not the oldest. I was careful on that. I didn't say the oldest. I said the longest serving.
I'm not that age sensitive, but I just want to precise that.
But you've weathered the financial crisis. You've been in there. I actually took a look at your stock's performance since you've taken over, and you've doubled your shares, and you're the best performing Canadian bank during that whole period. Having said all that, what's left for you to do, and when is it time to retire?
Very good question. Listen, I think we have to work on succession, and succession is not something you work on 6 months before you make the announcement. It's something that's goes back to to the fundamentals of how you preserve your culture and evolve your culture, and how do you manage talent within an organization. So, are we working on my succession, and who's going to be in terms of having talent that can replace me and replace the other members of senior management at the bank? Absolutely, of course we are. That's one of the main responsibilities we have. But in the meantime, I don't have I don't have any announcement to make today. Sorry about that.
Not that I'm trying to push you out.
No, thank you. But I think that's what we're working on, and one day we'll have to move on. I'm not the founder of National Bank. I'm not the owner of National Bank. At some point, as a CEO, things can you can do a good job, but at some point, when you have to move on, you have to move on. And you have to put your franchise ahead of your own personal agenda. That's the key thing.
And if we look back, it's 12 years in the seat. And I mean, what have you? And I know maybe it's too early to talk about your legacy, but looking over that 12-year period, what have you seen, or what are you particularly proud of, or what can you point to that beyond the share price, of course?
Yeah, I think the fact that we continue to evolve as an organization, and the evolution of the culture of the organization. And how's that reflected? It's reflected in, an international strategy that wasn't there 12 years ago, an international strategy that's quite different than our peers, a wealth management strategy that's also very different than our peers, that supports open architecture, and then very focused on not just on transactions, but more on advice. It's reflected in the fact that we've always believed in Quebec, always been proud to be a Quebec bank, and also the fact that we were comfortable with the capital markets business, whereas a lot of people were not comfortable with wholesale. And so we've had a path that's quite different than our peers, and we stuck to that path, and we feel we have the culture and and the talent to continue to move it forward. So that's what I think in a few words is what we think we've done the last 12 years. And I certainly did it all by it's not by myself. We did it as a team. And the day I retire, there's still going to be a very strong team to continue to take that path that's quite different.
And in terms of what's left to do, and that we have seen a lot of Canadian banks doing a little tuck-on acquisitions and things like that throughout the world. In the United States primarily with some of the other your bigger rivals in that. You've obviously had your international acquisitions, and now I guess we're talking divestitures in Africa. But is there anything else out there that you'd be considering looking at or wanting to do?
I think there's, the one area aside from international, and on the international front, we've been very we've said quite clearly that our main, we're not looking to do more acquisitions internationally. We really want to focus on the quality of our execution at Credit G and ABA Bank in Cambodia. Domestically, essentially all of our acquisitions in the last 12 years in Canada have been on the wealth management space. And so that added, we've added to National Bank Financial in terms of the full service advisory, a business we continue to believe in. Mm-hmm. And we made also the acquisition of TD Waterhouse Institutional Services to combine with Correspondent Network. And today we have by far the dominating business in providing back office services to independent wealth managers. So on the wealth management space, we continue to be interested, but they have to make sense from a financial standpoint and a cultural standpoint, both. So you do a screen, the way we look at the screen, it's a very few, there are very few dots that show up on that screen. For the rest, we'll focus on organic growth. But that's by far, and frankly, I've made acquisitions in the past, in the last 12 years. I don't like acquisitions. I feel they're risky. They really take a lot of time and attention, sometimes out of proportion to the financial impact they can potentially have. So I think management, our team knows that when they bring an acquisition thing to me, it has to be a pretty damn good thing. Because my first thing I say is, no, don't bother me. And that's the polite version of it. So I tend to be very skeptical in acquisitions. And I want my team to focus on organic growth.
Very good.
And capital management.
Last question in the dying seconds that we have here. And going back to your positiveness about the Quebec economy and that, but what keeps you awake at night?
So there was one of my competitors was asked that question on a panel a couple months ago and said, "I work so hard that nothing keeps me up at night." He's lost his job since then. I think the biggest, the wild card is, and aside from international uncertainty in terms of what the trade, how the global trading system will look like 3 years or 5 years down the road, cyber is always a big one. That's the one that you could wake up one day and data protection, and that's one we always have to take quite seriously, and that's one that continues to, I think, to get a lot of time and attention, rightfully so, from senior management in different organizations.
Very good. Well, I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Louis.
Thank you. Thank you very much.